Charlie Kirk is the head of a youth organization called Turning Point USA. It's mostly a big Trump
youth.
Yeah, mostly it's funded by really old people who like to hear young people say their beliefs back to them. And they have large conferences. They're very pro-Trump. They say they're, conservative, but they're really just kind of like a Trump shill organization. And Charlie's just a race baiter. He's an agitator. He likes to say things that get everybody up in arms and coming after him because that's how he gets more attention and then he gets more money. And for some godforsaken reason, conservative donors who the number one thing they'll talk to you about when you speak with them is like, we got to do more to reach younger people. We've got to do more to do youth outreach. And yet they keep giving millions of dollars to this kid who I would argue is one of the biggest turnoffs to young people I could fathomly imagine.
Well, he's like a meme among young people. He's kind of a joke.
He was on his show
all the time.
He what?
They make memes out of his forehead being enormous.
Yeah. Well, he just does weird stuff. He was on a show a few weeks ago wondering whether or not Taylor Swift had any eggs left. It's who talks like this? This is creepy and weird and cringe, but that's who this guy is. So you don't know who he is, you're lucky. We unfortunately come across him all the time. And he decided to spend Martin Luther King Jr. holiday bashing Martin Luther King. So I didn't listen to the full podcast. I think Twitter pretty much sums it up. So I'll cover what he wrote there. He said, "Who was MLK? A myth has been created and has grown totally out of control. While he was alive, most people disliked him, yet today he is the most honored, worshipped, even deified person of the 20th century. Today we are going to tell the truth and explain how this myth was born. Happy Monday." So he then took to his podcast where he announced a campaign against Martin Luther King Jr. And this got immediate backlash from mostly Black conservatives I saw, which I appreciate because for the longest time, he's been allowed to get away with this notion of he does all this youth outreach and he can reach people in the Black community and he's bringing all these new demographics into the GOP. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever. He had Candace Owens kind of for a little bit as his token proof, and she has no Black people in her audience that I've yet to see. So anyways, they actually kind of started speaking out. And I feel for a long time, a lot of people would not speak out against Charlie because they were scared of turning off his base or turning off his donors. But he really seems to have crossed a line because they were immediately pushing back on this. And it was widespread. I've got a few of these tweets I'll have you read in just a second. He then took to Twitter to make another post where he said, "The deification of MLK and his proto-DEI ideology marks the exact moment that the progress of Black America goes sideways. Their cities disintegrate, their families collapse, educational progress stagnates, they become enormously dependent on government support. Crime explodes and 25% of Black men are incarcerated by age 25. You will know the tree by its fruit." Brad, will you read some of these reactions to these comments he made from others online?
Yeah, so a woman named Kimberly Klasick says, "Loving the quote tweets here. Black voters considering voting for Trump in November, now changing their minds. Congrats, I guess. This must have been the goal, cause WTF else could it be?" Another person just said, "You are a garbage, bigoted human being," in quotes with a human being. Somebody named Charisse Lane tweeted, "I wanted to follow up with this by saying that this is why I left his organization. I used to be an ambassador because I thought Charlie Kirk really cared about the Black community and opening our eyes to conservatism. In 2020, I quickly realized that was so far from the truth. He and several of his counterparts hate anything having to do with celebrating Black culture or Black progression. They are, in fact, anti-Black, and I realized I did not want to be affiliated with him or anybody with him, so I left for good in 2020. They're absolutely no help to the Black conservative movement or the Republican Party, and anybody who even cares an inch about the Black community for real would not associate themselves with him."
Sonny Johnson, who's a pretty well-known Black conservative, said, "Charlie Kirk and his ilk are why Black conservatives can't fight Black Democrats. Y'all are a direct threat to Black America. We can't leave you unattended for a minute." So I want to go back to his second tweet, though, because not only is this, I think, racist on its face, but it's completely asshat backwards. He's not wrong about some of the trajectory of the Black community beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, but he's completely wrong about why that occurred, right? So he talked
blaming it on MLK?
And I want to be clear, what he's actually blaming it on is MLK's achievements, which would be the Civil Rights Act.
Civil rights?
Basically saying that things were good under Jim Crow, and if it weren't for damn Martin Luther King Jr., none of these things would have happened.
And the other interesting thing, just to make a quick point, is he calls it MLK's proto-DEI ideology. That means like the pre-DEI or whatever. But what I'm actually going to explain when we talk about the left is that like the new DEI movement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is in many ways the antithesis of MLK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, MLK had a colorblind vision for the future, and he stated that many times. That is the opposite of what most people want under DEI. And look, I am not here to simp for Martin Luther King Jr. He was a very flawed character.
A flawed individual.
He was a socialist. He did not share many of my views. But that being said, he was absolutely right on civil liberties and on working to overturn racist Jim Crow laws. And I've written about this extensively. I've done a whole video on this. I think his tactics for how he achieved that should be studied. I think his philosophy of nonviolence is brilliant and revolutionary and can be replicated today. And not enough people really study what he did during that time. So I can hold both of these things to be true. But when Charlie talks about the family's collapse, what happened after the Civil Rights Act is really important. You had the launch of the war on drugs, which has been used to target Black communities and lock up Black men in droves. It broke up the family. You also had the launch of LBJ's war on poverty, which, Brad, as you know, anytime the government launches a war on something, we get more of it. Poverty had been very quickly diminishing in this country up until those programs were put into place. And since they were implemented, we have seen it stagnate. That progress has actually stopped because of government expenditures in those areas. And that's because they did a lot of things to grow the welfare state, to make people more dependent on the government, to relieve men and women at times too, but mostly men, of the duties they had to take care of kids that they created and show up in the homes. They undercut the need for people to have jobs. And so these results in the Black community and in the country at large are the result of terrible government interventions into the market and socialism and welfare type programs that they were pushing to expand. So he's to blame Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Act for these things is not only just absurd, it's so ignorant of history. Like, I don't know how this person has a platform. I am literally getting dumber just discussing his thoughts.
I think it's just edgelording. I just think he wants to be. Everyone basically agrees that MLK, while a flawed person, his basic principles are basically universally agreed upon now, of like non-discrimination, of, opposing segregation, of wanting a colorblind. Like, I have a dream that one day people will be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. Basically, everybody nominally agrees with his most prominent teachings about politics and society. And so he has to edgelord and go after it is really, I think, the only explanation. So while we're on this subject, the other thing I wanted to briefly talk about was the modern DEI movement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I actually think it's really interesting, is becoming openly the opposite of what MLK believed in. So my thoughts were brought back to this topic by this headline that I want to read to you, Hannah. Flour Company Baking Contest only allowing people of color to enter. The King Arthur Baking Company is hosting a baking contest that will only allow people of color to participate. They define that as Asian or Pacific Islander, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latinx, which is not a real word, Indigenous or Native American, Middle Eastern or North African. So basically, no whites. And that's like woke and progressive now. And obviously it's just one crazy example, but like, we're seeing this kind of thing more and more. I mean, Dish, the TV service provider, just posted a job position and specifically said for a senior sourcing manager, a job based in Colorado, and they specifically said that they will be prioritizing applications from these backgrounds: Hispanic, Asian, LGBTQ. What does that mean? And isn't that illegal?
I've been asking this for years. This is the exact same thing I was told when I worked for the left-wing company, where I was like, they wanted us to prioritize hiring people of color. And I was like, am I going to go to jail? Like, is that legal? Like, I don't understand, but they would put it like right on the applications, like in bold, in print, and it's right there, the proof. So obviously they're not worried about getting sued. And my thought is that it is illegal, but the optics of it would be so bad that the government's not going to go after them for that. So
Yeah,
I think
probably
maybe
not. But
nice.
and look, those are just two tiny examples. But you think about the self-segregated Black only or LGBT only graduation ceremonies that colleges have.
What?
Oh, have you not heard of that?
No.
Oh, yeah. They have separate graduations for Black students at many colleges now. My college had it for all the racial groups and for LGBT. You still go to the main graduation, but then you have a separate ceremony that's just for the Black students or just for the rainbow students.
Why?
Because of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's like this is what I'm getting at. Many major companies now have racial affinity groups where all the Black employees get together in like a club for the Blacks only, or or the Hispanics or the LGBTs. And it's like, what my interpretation of MLK, right, and the colorblind principle is that for so long as a society, we had unfairly marginalized and treated people differently on the basis of their immutable characteristics. But that what we wanted to do as a nation, what we dreamed of, and what we embraced in MLK's dream was the idea of a society where demographics fade into the background, where skin color is viewed like hair color or eye color, where no one is treated differently because of it. Nobody really thinks that much about it. But I actually think the modern DEI movement is really becoming the opposite. They're like, actually, race is essential. It is a key component of who you are. It is deeply meaningful, and we must celebrate it and actively uplift some races over others in the name of justice this time. I mean, you think of affirmative action, this system where Asian people were literally openly discriminated against and Black people were openly given preferential treatment. It's like, that is literal racial discrimination, but it's to promote diversity. So it's okay. And it's like, I actually think that we are straying deeply on the left and in socially progressive institutions and spaces are also straying away from MLK's message, honestly, maybe more than the right is.
Honestly, I can't get past the separate graduations. I'm just picturing how humiliating it would be to be like in a little women's only like graduation, like, good job, honey. Like,
I don't even think women get one.
Yeah, we're not minority enough, right? we're too privileged now.
Are you technically the majority? Aren't there more women than men?
I think so. I think by
so
like
really,
slightly.
the men should get one.
Yeah. Don't let the red pillars know that. They will be campaigning in a minute. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that when you get into what the left is doing right now, it is racist. It is patronizing. And it is mostly, from what I can tell, coming from like coastal white elite liberals and not the people of color who are on the left. I heard this interview. It was frankly hilarious. I love to listen to New York Times daily podcast. It's a wild ride. And they decided that they were going to like drum up some energy around affirmative action being overturned and how bad this is and how it's just like left all these seniors scrambling for what they should do this year. And so they go into a high school and they're interviewing these students, like, how big of a deal is this to you? And they're like, yeah, I haven't thought about it. Like, it's just not even like registering to them. They're like, oh, I guess I should worry about it. Like, it's hilarious. It's completely New York Times contrived. The students aren't even really aware of what's changed. They're just like applying to college like they normally would be. And it's so ridiculous. I mentioned this last episode, I think, but the fact that they recently said over 70% of people teaching DEI are like white men, like this is not something that I think helps Black people. And if you study Martin Luther King Jr.'s tactics, his theory of nonviolence and his 6 principles of change, they actually, this kind of development pushes back against the wisdom that you would find within them because it breeds so much animosity in other people and it makes them, feel some kind of way and not really want to come to your cause. What Martin Luther King Jr. actually said, I think it's principle number 5, is that there's power in unearned suffering. So what he's saying is like when there actually is racism and racism occurs, rather than trying to like go after the person who's guilty or harm them back, instead you should not react. You should stay nonviolent and actually try to be loving back towards them and allow people to see it. And that would awaken a sense of moral shame in society. And that would create this power and undeserved suffering. And so his posture, everything about how he was moving is entirely different than these people who say, like, you should answer for the crimes of your forefathers and you should feel so guilty and I should get all these things that you don't get and you should have to give up stuff to give to me. It's communism, and it's patently unfair, and it is going to eventually stir up resentment and I think lead to more racism, right? I think it actually is something that endangers people of color. So it's very, very foolish. I don't think Martin Luther King Jr. would approve, even though he had some like socialist instincts when it came to his economic views. The way that they're moving and going about this is completely counterintuitive.